In the silent dawn Sea of Azov, a Russian Buyan-M class corvette, armed with Kalibr cruise missiles, was preparing to launch attacks against Ukrainians, protected by modern systems and valued at $500 million, untouchable. But on the other side, an operation meticulously planned by Ukrainian intelligence was already underway. Special units, such as the Kraken, had prepared a swarm of 7 drones, each with a precise function. The fast and agile Rybaka to silence radars, and the heavier Bober for the final strike. What followed was a choreography of asymmetric warfare, drones cutting through signal jammers, dodging anti-aircraft guns, and exploiting flaws in Russian defenses. Within minutes, the ground radars were destroyed, the corvette was blinded, and its own onboard sensors were forced to operate at a disadvantage. When the attack drones struck the main radar mast and the missile compartment, the vessel was neutralized. A victory measured not only in material damage, but in proof that accessible technology and intelligent tactics can turn the tables against a far more powerful enemy. On the morning of August 28, 2025, precisely at 3:20 a.m., an unprecedented scene began to unfold in one of Russia's most protected areas. The result, seen hours later, was a warship worth nearly $80 million being hastily towed, unable to continue operating. But before reaching this outcome, it is necessary to understand how it all began. The target was a Buyan-M class ship belonging to the Black Sea Fleet. Compact, yet extremely dangerous, it was considered a key piece for Russia's long-range strikes against Ukrainian cities. Designed to operate in inland waters, such as the Sea of Azov and the Caspian, it could launch Kalibr-NK missiles with enough range to hit virtually any point in Ukraine. Every time it left port, it left behind uncertainty. What would be the next target? A power plant, a fuel depot, or even a kindergarten? That night, the Buyan-M was moored at Military Pier No. 2 in Temryuk Bay, a location considered untouchable by Moscow, more than 100 kilometers from the front line. Russian confidence was so high that the vessel was in the middle of refueling. It was being refueled, cooling its systems, and, more importantly, reloading its powerful Kalibr missile. The routine seemed calm. Part of the crew was on rest rotation, some even asleep at their control posts. The guard was down, and no one suspected what was silently approaching through the dark waters. This climate of false security set the stage for one of the boldest blows ever launched by Ukraine. And it was at this very moment, when the enemy's confidence was at its peak, that the threat began to move. And this brings us to the unexpected arrival of a vessel that looked nothing like a military craft. Just over 9 kilometers from the bay, a small boat advanced silently through the darkness. To any casual observer, it looked like a simple civilian fishing boat, nothing special. But inside the cabin were no ordinary fishermen. 2 men from Ukraine's 73rd Naval Center, Special Forces veterans, disguised in jackets and Russian fisherman caps, remained focused. They had a clear mission to turn that seemingly harmless boat into a modern Trojan horse. The secret was in the rear compartment. Where styrofoam boxes full of fish would normally be, there was something entirely different. Stored there were 2 FPV suicide drones of the Beaver model, prepared in heavy configuration. Each carried piercing warheads of nearly 4 kilograms, designed to penetrate warship arms. Equipped with night vision cameras and GPS-independent navigations, these UAVs could operate without relying on satellite, flying low and fast, practically invisible to radar. These small machines were the true firepower of the operation. Inexpensive compared to the value of the target, the Beaver drones were capable of transforming a civilian boat into a lethal platform. And that dawn, they would be the instrument of an attack that would go down in history. But the task was far from simple. Temryuk Bay was considered by Russia to be an impenetrable fortress. On the shores and hills around it, air defense was reinforced by Pantsir S-1 systems, specialized in intercepting drones and cruise missiles at short ranges. In addition, 2 Podlet K-1 radar stations operated continuously, monitoring every object in the sky, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For Moscow, that port was a steel nest, where no intruder could survive. However, the Ukrainians had identified an almost imperceptible gap. A blind spot in the radars, a narrow zone near the sea surface that seemed harmless but could be exploited to infiltrate the weapon no one expected. And it was precisely along this invisible path that the first wave of attack would begin to approach. The key was not to fight the fortress, but to bypass. The drones did not come from the sky. They came from sea level, practically glued to the waves, where the electronic eyes of radars cannot properly see. This was the vulnerability the Ukrainians exploited. In the final minutes, the vessel reached the designated point. Just a few kilometers from the target, the two soldiers on deck worked with the precision of men who had rehearsed this dozens of times. The tarps were removed silently. The navigation modules were activated. The internal systems, designed to fly without GPS, were armed. It all lasted seconds, each movement calculated not to attract attention. When the vehicles were released, there was no triumphant ascent into the sky. They burst across the sea surface, flying so low they nearly scraped the waves. This was the tactical decision that made the attack possible, flying in the so-called radar blind zone, a tiny strip between the sea and the scanning angles of sensors. At just a few meters altitude, the drones became almost shadows, ghostly, hard to distinguish from ambient noise. The first pair of machines raced through the dark with a dual synchronized mission. The plan foresaw two attack vectors, one to blind and disorganize, the other to strike the ship's heart. Hrom, Thunder, flew straight toward the radar tower, programmed to destroy the main source of surveillance and guidance of the ship. Vidplata, Retribution, maintained a 30-degree offset course, closing in behind the first to take advantage of the temporary blindness and strike the vertical launch system S-14, where the valuable Kalibr missiles were stored. The drones were small and stealthy, but not slow. They kept speeds that allowed them to cover the critical distance in seconds, navigating through inertial algorithms and visual corrections captured by night vision cameras. Flying just feet above the sea, they passed under the scanning beams of the Podlit K1 stations and approached the target without triggering the Pantsir S1, which at that moment was incapable of adequately covering such a low layer. The brutal beauty of the tactic lay in synchronization. Hrom did not need to destroy everything. It only had to blind the enemy for fractions of a second. Vidplata had been adjusted to exploit precisely this window, to strike the vulnerable point that opened in the interval between the first impact and any attempt at organized reaction. It was a war of precision and timing. One blow to take away vision, another to strike the heart. From the remote control, the operators watched on monitors with held breath. The black and white feed showed the mast, the coverings, and the details of the deck. The distance readings dropped: 950 feet, 800, 650. No effective response came from the ship. The radar kept rotating, perhaps without realizing the danger creeping below the line of its beams. And then, at the peak of that calculated synchronism, the two vectors became visible to anyone looking closely. A sudden flash that cut the night, followed almost immediately by a second impact. And this is the next chapter. The seconds that turned Russian confidence into chaos and revealed in raw how two cheap drones can incapacitate a naval giant. At 0:31 and 25 seconds, hell fell upon the Buyan-M. The first drone, named Hrom, struck the radar tower head-on. A massive explosion ripped through the night, scattering burning debris and completely blinding the Russian ship. Amid smoke and panic, the officers tried to understand what had happened. There was no time. Just fractions of a second later, the second drone, Vidplata, reached the heart of the ship, the 3S-14 vertical launcher, where the Kalibr missiles were prepared to be loaded. The impact tore open the deck like paper, and a fireball lit up the entire bay. On board, chaos was absolute. The fire suppression system activated, but too late. Flames spread through the electrical compartment and the launch control center. The ship began to tilt 3 to 5 degrees to the side, a clear sign of internal flooding. The crew ran desperately through smoke and debris, trying to save injured comrades and contain the advancing fire. The commander, as a last resort, sent an urgent message through the Black Sea Fleet's military channel. Buyan-M ship B-38 attacked, radar destroyed. Kalibr system damaged. Request immediate support and towing. Ukraine, hours later, left no room for doubt. The Defense Intelligence Directorate released the footage captured by the drones themselves, showing every detail of the destruction. The world watched, incredulous, as specialized outlets like Naval News and the Kyiv Post confirmed the authenticity of the attack. A ship worth $80 million had been neutralized by drones that cost less than 1% of its value. And this would not be merely a tactical victory. Russia's confidence in its safe ports and layered defenses had been broken. The Black Sea Fleet, until then untouchable in Temryuk, now had to live with the invisible and constant threat of Ukrainian drones. But the consequences would not end there. The impact of this attack would reverberate far beyond Temryuk Bay, changing the way naval warfare would be fought in the months to come. This attack was not just the destruction of a warship, it was the practical demonstration of how naval warfare has entered a new era. Instead of frigates, submarines, and million-dollar jets, the protagonist was a modest, cheap, and ingenious drone. Ukraine showed the world that asymmetric warfare is not theory, but reality, and that an intelligent adversary can use accessible technology to hit high-value strategic targets. For Russia, the operation exposed a deep wound. A port considered invulnerable, protected by radars and cutting-edge defenses, proved fragile in the face of an enemy that thinks outside the box. The perception of security in its rear bases was broken, and with it, the confidence in its own ability to keep the fleet safe. More than a tactical attack, it was a psychological blow. The message was clear. No Russian ship in any port would be completely protected. The threat could come from any direction, at any time, carried out by an operator hidden kilometers away. On the morning of August 28, 2025, a ship worth $80 million was neutralized by drones that cost only a fraction of that. But the true victory was strategic. Naval warfare would never be the same again. And if you want to follow closely how technology is redefining the battlefield, subscribe to the channel.